In this first session, we will be exploring why well-being is central to the future of work. And as Jim has already said, this is a little bit the school of obvious in that work and its relationship with health and wider well-being is a very well-established relationship. We know that good work supports good life. It supports sufficient income to feed, clothe and warm your family. It supports dignity, social networks, and autonomy, amongst so much else that underpins well-being and health in general. We also know that bad work does just the opposite. It undermines dignity, it undermines autonomy, it creates insecurity, and doesn't pay sufficiently to support a very basic level of well-being and life. So I'm going to say nothing more than that, other than to introduce our very eminent panel this morning, who will be taking us through the relationship between labour market change and work in well-being. So I think this is a really well-timed conference because never more have we been aware of the impact of change and the need to forecast forward how it might be affecting our lives. So thank you very much to our panel. We have Dr. Jennifer Dixon, CEO of the Health Foundation. We have Nancy Hay, Executive Director of the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, and of course we have Professor Sir Chris Pissarides. If you don't mind, I'm going to ask each of you to give us a 4 or 5 minute précis of your take on the topic. If we could start with Chris, seeing as he's in the middle, and then we'll move across, if you don't mind, Jennifer, to you and to Nancy. Chris, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jolene, and a warm welcome from me as well. I'm very pleased to see you here, and we look forward to hearing any comments you might have, questions, or anything. So I'm going to be very brief. What we are talking about today in this session, is well-being at work, especially when there is change at work. And it kind of strikes me that if you look at the media and reports and all that, when they are talking about work and what's the biggest problem we're facing at work today, there's no doubt that what you're going to see is mentioned all the time is productivity. They will say it's a productivity puzzle. I always wondered why it's a puzzle. When you don't invest, you don't grow. Basically, it's sort of economics 101, basically. And they go on, and there are productivity commissions and skills commissions and all that. But in fact, I think when it comes down to it, so well-being at work is more important than productivity. We should be paying more attention to it. Now, why might you say that? Well, if you remember that this conference was first scheduled for September, and unfortunately we had to postpone it because of the passing of the Queen, and Richard Laird was going to sit where I'm sitting here. So I'm going to repeat what you have said to you then, if you could make it today. And it's basically because we spend so much of our time at work that if we care about subjective well-being, how happy people are, then we should care about how they feel when they're at work. And the way people feel at work, although pay affects the way they feel, and pay is affected by productivity, they care about a lot of other things, which Jolene mentioned. They care about autonomy, about relations with their managers, the influence they have in the company. Some survey that Richard had shown me that asks people what makes them most unhappy. And number 1 is commuting to work, and number 2 is seeing the boss at work. Well, that doesn't tell you much about their well-being at work, but they hate going to work and they hate being there when their boss asks to see them. So we should be doing something about it, and I should emphasize that it's subjective. It's sort of how people, how happy are people. Now, others might say, well, we should care about good work because it affects productivity, and I have seen that in fact being said by the CPI. That's absolutely fine. If we get productivity, even if we aim for productivity, if you like, through providing good work, and we get as a byproduct happiness, then so be it. I mean, I enjoy happiness more than productivity myself if I were subjected to that. Although I should say that whenever there are surveys, no one says that they're happier with their work than academics, university professors. So maybe we shouldn't draw too many parallels from the work that we are doing. Now, why don't we see more of good work? And the answer is simply because implementation is very difficult. It's very difficult for bosses to know how to do it. And if you ask senior people, CEOs and all that, does your company offer good jobs? They will say yes. It's one of those things like, it's like if you ask American professors about their students applying to graduate schools, the vast majority, if not all, will say that their students are above average. And it's exactly what CEOs will say about work. Are you providing good work? They will say, oh, definitely above the average in the country, which it cannot be, of course. So how do you do it? How do you bring about a good work? And I think the way to do it is to include criteria. As a board, in big companies especially, the board of directors should have criteria of good work in the way they evaluate how the company performs when they do their evaluations. Now they just look at financial criteria, share value, profitability, their investments, and so on, and leave it at that. But you could define good work precisely, like there are things like how much flexibility is there in the hours of work, or in the hours that they work. Do you give good opportunities or good provision for work-life balance? What kind of information do you give about your work to your employees? How much flexibility do they have in changing their roles at work? All those are criteria of good work. We'll draw up a list and check that list when you evaluate how well your company is performing. And if it's not performing well, then reduce their bonuses or whichever way, or give them more incentives. I think it's the only way to do it. Just talking about it, and I'm sorry about what's coming next time. If you go to Davos and listen to that and tell them there. I'm only mentioning it because we were saying earlier that Davos has just finished and all the big bosses were there. I'm sure when they're there, they're talking about good work, what I said, that their companies offer good work. But when you don't evaluate it, then you don't see where you stand. That's it, actually. I mean, some other things I should mention that struck me about good work is that I've seen an estimate again by the CBI, in fact, that if British CEOs applied the management practices that American CEOs do, because the Americans are more successful in providing at least some of the features of good work that we mentioned, then British productivity alone will go up by 12%. Now, 12% is sufficient. Maybe we'll stop listening to the big puzzle of productivity. It is a big increase. I was surprised by how big it was. And the way it works is partly through the incentives that people will have to work harder if they define their own roles within the company, and partly that they'll be much more welcoming to new technology, that they will be much more willing to introduce the new technology if they know they're safe at work, that they will not be kicked out because of the new technology being introduced, and they will help adapt their role given the new technology and therefore become more productive. So I would leave it at that. We'll choose people targets.
Thank you very much.
Fire CEOs that don't follow them.
Oh, well, I'm very nervous of any recommendation that we follow American labour practice where you can fire anyone at any time. That's quite an incentive to work harder. I think on that point we might turn over, Jennifer, if you don't mind, to you and get your thoughts on this and on the related subject. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jolene, and welcome, and very nice to see everybody, and again, looking forward to questions later. So just a few probably statements of the bleeding obvious, I guess, if you don't mind. So first, why should we be bothered by health and well-being at work? Well, one of the reasons in this country is we've got a labour shortage, you all know that. In my area, healthcare, there's a global labour shortage, which is terrifying, considering the amount of healthcare we're going to need in future. We've obviously got an ageing population, you know that too. About 2/3 of us will have a chronic disease by the time we're 68, of pensionable age. Many more people start collecting chronic diseases at the age of 51, particularly if you live in the lowest socioeconomic quintile. We've also got an interesting problem, whether it's acute or chronic, of a rise in economic inactivity. You'll have been reading about that in the press. Particularly with the over 50s rather, leaving the workforce. Not sure whether it's health, but health is implicated, even if people are making lifestyle choices. But we've also got an issue with 16 to 24-year-old males, an increasing number of those not in education, employment or anything. Don't know what's happening there either. So those are some background issues. Also health trends. If you look at the future morbidity load of the population over the next 30 years, most of it is actually going to be the result of ageing rather than just the fact that we're getting sicker. However, we are getting sicker in some areas, and I think some of the areas that I particularly would point out would be mental health. And as I said, we start collecting chronic diseases at between the ages of 51 if you're in the lowest socioeconomic, 71, 20 years later if you're in the richest. But there's a lot of those clusters that will be developed. So a lot of us will be having and carrying chronic diseases. And having to manage those. So in short, the workers that we will have will be older. They will have collections of long-term conditions, and many of them will have some sort of mental ill health incapacity. So that's the kind of health. So some of these things we can do some things about, and some of the things we can't. So we can't do much about ageing, can we? I mean, in fact, that's a good thing. Unless we want to have massive migration, which we've turned our face against, at least in the short term. Some of the risk factors that injure health, mental health, obesity, smoking, air quality, we can do something about those risk factors, and that's where you look to governments to have big preventive strategies across the board affecting the populations, population-based public health. But there's also issues to do with work practices, as Chris points out, and to try to improve well-being at work. Particularly the things that injure your health at work are low autonomy, inflexibility, pay and conditions, job insecurity, as well as the traditional safety and occupational diseases. So there's a lot that employers can be doing, and indeed the government in its wraparound protective shield of workers, which has kind of become weaker over time. We'll talk about that. And maybe unions as well have a role. And then obviously the state have a role on the wider determinants of health that are affecting the population, which are the things you know about: poverty, housing, education, and so on and so forth. So those are some causes that we can have some action on. In terms of the future objectives, what are we then aiming for? Well, of course, we are aiming for productivity, because we need that, don't we, to, as Chris says, and there technology can help us, no doubt. But technology can also help support older workers who are maybe not so healthy, stay in work for longer, which is what we're going to need. We also need to have objectives of flexibility, pay, greater autonomy and well-being at work as described. And the other thing I think we need, looking at the country at the moment, if you look at the health map, the fabric of health has frayed the most in certain parts of the country, in particular the northeast, where people are dying far younger. And in particular, there's a worrying increase in uptick in mortality, which is unique internationally, as far as I can see, in the 25 to 44-year-old age group, men dying before their time. Again, these would be prime workers. So last point for me then, where do we then act in this rather gloomy picture? Well, we can talk about how, but effectively the actors here, there've been numerous reports, haven't there? Health at Work, Carol Black's report, etc., etc. I mean, government clearly has to act on wider preventive strategies. to try and improve population health, but also, as I say, on the protective shield for workers in terms of terms and conditions, which has become weaker over time. Employers clearly have a role, as Chris says. The unions have a role too. And that's good. And the other area that I think could have an increasing role, talking about Davos, are investors, because at the moment we've got ESG talking about green capital and acting, and now we need to act far more on health capital as well. So let's put an H into ESG, as they say, and there is some action which I can talk about later if people are interested. So don't forget the investors' role and their influence on industry if industry are not listening. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And last but not least, wrapping up just the panel presentations, Nancy, lovely, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Nancy Hay. I'm the Exec Director at the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, and we're a collaborating centre aiming to understand what organisations in all sectors can do to improve people's lives, improve wellbeing in a sustainable way over a long term. And that's governments, businesses, charities, all 19 sectors of the economy. And what looks like wellbeing in different areas of the economy will be very different depending on the jobs that you do and the people that are employed in those. And we need to get much sharper at understanding what works in those sectors rather than doing the latest thing. And I think the research base really needs to improve, which is why I'm really excited to see that serious amounts of research money are going into this area, because the quality of the evidence base hasn't shifted in a long time and it needs to. Widely shared prosperity is absolutely necessity for a thriving nation. So if we want to have a sustainable future as a nation, you need widely shared prosperity, and jobs are a major part of that. And work beyond just the pay that we get from it, all the other things that have been mentioned. We are seeing an accelerating pace of change, and we saw that change rapidly, particularly with digital, accelerated during the pandemic, but actually lots of other shifts occurred as well. And most of these changes will come from industry and innovation, as has happened before with the creation of the shipping container, with shifts in mining, in shifts in shipyards, and all these other ones that we've seen over the centuries. What we need to do now is try and avoid the intergenerational damage to individuals and communities that happened in the past. And we can. I think it's really, really super exciting. So there's a really big picture in this. We know that both health and work, as well as our relationships, are essential to adult wellbeing. So we know that the top 3 drivers of adult wellbeing at 34 are physical and mental health is the top. Second is our relationships, and our third is a job. And that is big. We also know that we adapt to most things in life. We adapted phenomenally well to the pandemic, albeit we need to watch out for any lasting harms, particularly those around employment and health, actually, which I think potentially are quite long-lasting. And these have spillovers to families and to communities. So if you lose your job, we know that is one of the things that reduces your well-being longer term, which has implications for your health, for your ability to perform well in a job, and our civic and personal capacities as well. So it's quite important that we tackle this now. And those intergenerational effects are quite terrifying too. So they can happen to individuals, but also communities and place. It's not agnostic in that, which is why we need to sort of look geographically across the UK and what happens in every region and nation within it. We know that the impact of a job is more than the money, although fair pay is really important, and actually job security, particularly at different times of your life, really, really matters. But other things matter too, and they've been eroding. So autonomy at work has absolutely fallen through the floor in the last 25 years, and we don't know why, and there are 0 interventions that have been tested to look at whether that's the case. We also know that we're happiest at 23 and at 68, and least happy in our 40s. This midlife crisis is absolutely real. We also know that being ill in bed is the most miserable thing we can do, and after that it's being in the presence of your line manager, which is the next thing. But if we look at the age of our line managers, particularly those not at the top of the organisation, they are in that peak misery bit. So it's all very well saying management really matters, but actually what are we doing to support those managers? And actually performance management is hard, it's emotional, and actually being told you're not doing what you need to do is always a difficult thing, which is why it's not a straightforward thing as saying just improve our management. How can we improve management per se? And I think we know that good management practices really help. That's really clear. But there's some things that I think that we can focus on that we've realised are a bit more important. So our physical bodies, our musculoskeletal conditions change over our lifetimes. Our mental health at work becomes much more important. But again, that's an area that really we're at the limits, I think, of implementing what we know on mental health. So again, that mental health research needs to come in. But actually that ability to switch jobs, to deal with change as we progress over our lifetimes, as industry changes, is something we've really not tackled. And lifelong learning is such a part of that, and actually something that is a wellbeing incentive in the workplace as well. So really should be a no-brainer. But lastly, we should measure job quality. We've got measures of national job quality that are recommended. We haven't yet done it, and we can't get that data available at a local level. We can also match them to the employer. So we can do this, it's there. We just need to make it happen now. But getting that robust evidence in place is really important. We're at the limits of it, and that's why research like this really matters.
Thank you very much. That's excellent. Well, I suppose actually on that measurement of job quality, I should mention that the Institute for the Future of Work has today launched a Good Work Monitor that is attempting to do just that using available data. So do go and take a look if you're curious. Nancy, I'd love to stick with you for the moment, if you don't mind. You mentioned our adaptation to the pandemic, and what I'd like to know are, from your point of view, what are some of the key factors influencing work and well-being post-pandemic?
This is really interesting. The House of Lords looked at this and then life beyond COVID, and we were trying to sort of think forward 3 to 5 years, and it's quite hard to do that. What we can see, well, so lots of people shifted to working from home, and that commute change really happened, and that was a time use thing, right? Yeah. Suddenly, and as well as money, actually. But suddenly you had extra hours in the day, and during the pandemic, we couldn't use them. But actually, most people, like 60-70% of people, never shifted from their work location and probably can't, right? And so how do you support those people who are in different situations as well? I think we saw, so that digitisation was one, and actually lots of professions and industries that didn't think they could digitise did. And actually, we start to wonder whether services are being delivered face-to-face or in person, because that supports the well-being of the worker or the quality of the service. E-learning is a classic, right? Actually, e-learning works brilliantly well for knowledge mobilisation, knowledge transfer, but doesn't get these other things. So we need to get much smarter about why we need face-to-face and when we need it, including for the worker well-being as well as the service delivered. But we all saw a dip in well-being, but some professions saw more. So care, leisure and service industries, sales and customer service saw big changes, and there were big stresses as well. But actually the biggest drops in life satisfaction were from the professional occupations. And actually that's really interesting. So I don't think any professional group is immune here. And I think that's one of the exciting things where actually it does affect everybody, but in different ways.
I feel like you're telling me I'm at the peak of my misery at every point.
It's always good.
Well, there you go. You can only get better.
But you're in the right profession for not being unhappy.
Hopefully. Okay. Jennifer, if you don't mind, I would like to pick up on what you said about the role of investors.
Yeah.
And there wasn't time to unpack what you thought the role of investors should be within this. And I'd really love to give you some space to do that, if you don't mind. What is the role of investors in improving the relationship between work and well-being?
Thank you. Well, I think the first thing is if you think about the green journey, one of the first things that was done, apart from bang the drum about green capital and how important it was to consider that in investors, is to start with metrics. And this is what we're now trying to do, to develop a series of metrics by which investors can use to report back on, so for example, we have funded a long-term programme, a 3-year programme with another charity for Share Action to develop those metrics with a whole group of investors. We've got investors around the table that carry 2 trillion of investment, to work with them to figure out what would be a lean way of trying to develop some measures for health. And what that means is that if an investor, I mean, we have an endowment, we have investment managers, is that when we have conversations with them, we don't just ask them to report on green, their carbon footprint, for example, but we could in future then start asking them, what are the health impacts of the businesses that you're invested in, and that might influence the way we decide to develop our portfolio, for example. I mean, being the Health Foundation, you would expect. I mean, we don't invest in tobacco, for example. But it's like one step on from that. So that's a lot of work that will have to happen, but that will then have to filter into more widespread use. But that is the place to start. So we've got this thing called LIFE programme, Long-Term Investors for People Health, that we have funded with another charity that Share Action is leading. So expect more on that in future. Hopefully we'll get some traction.
Let's hope. Yes, that sounds really positive. And actually maybe segues rather well into what I wanted to ask you, Chris, I was really hoping for some of the impacts of technological transformation on well-being, because that, I would imagine, is what these investors would need to target in order to improve those metrics of well-being. So what can we expect to be the positive or negative impacts of technological transformation on well-being?
You see, in the old days, which maybe 10 years ago, when we talked about technology, that it was always fear that they will take away our jobs and we'll all be unemployed and all that, which was completely misdirected. In fact, technology, when it comes to technology and jobs, it's one of the most positive things that could happen, because we now have technologies, especially, and I mean digital technologies, which of course applies only to jobs that use the digital technologies, to enable a much better balance between time at work and time at home. Working from home, or even it doesn't necessarily have to be on a specific day a week, every Friday I'm at home, that kind of thing. But when necessary, I can work from home, I can work in the office. You could use technology like robots to do the heavy, boring work, and therefore you focus more on more planning, on the more pleasant tasks. Think of Amazon warehouses. If you had manually workers taking boxes down from all the shelves instead of the robots, how much worse those jobs would be. And that's at work. Now, I mentioned before that commuting to work is awful and gives people a lot of unhappiness. Well, you could use the technology to regulate, traffic in the streets. When trains would run, they don't have to leave every 3 minutes or whatever, but leave at the frequency that you see people waiting at stations. With buses, it helps even more. It's all those, and it's endless, really. If you look at almost every aspect of life that involves work and all that, it can be improved with the new technologies we have at our disposal. In agriculture, I know we don't employ many people in agriculture here, but what they produce is still absolutely essential. Technology has probably had more impact than anywhere else, using drones to tell you what sections need water, what sections of fields need watering, what fruit is ready to pick, rather than send workers out looking manually. It's all these things. You can draw a list that is so long that you might think, where do I start, where do I stop? But there needs to be sort of different groups focused on different things, and then if you put them all together, you will see what vast difference it will make.
Jennifer, did you want to come in on that?
Yes, it's just sorry to have a niche comment about my own area, healthcare, because healthcare is one of the biggest growing industries in the world. As
of course,
know,
health I didn't mention. Yeah.
Quite a lot of issues, and apart from all the enhanced drug discovery and development and all kinds of things as you expect, I think the nature of care will change, being an interesting service industry, and that decision support tools based on AI, for example, could really shift the balance of workers away from clinician to say highly qualified medical people to others who can safely now make decisions on diagnostics with decision support tools. And actually, there's a really interesting book, and I'm sure many of you've read it, by Pissarides. on the future of the professions. And one of the things they predict for medicine, being one of these disgruntled and burned out professional groups, is that it will free up a lot of medical people to work in the unprotocolized space. So the protocolized space, standard stuff can be done by others with decision support, leaving medicine to be much more of a craft, which is probably the best place for it in a sense, where you haven't seen stuff before and it's unusual. So it may add to the joy of work as well as help solve some of our worker issues in the healthcare space.
Thank you, that's really useful. Did you want to add anything to that, Nancy?
Yeah. So it can improve literally our time at work. So the time use data shows us that doing our life admin in person is slightly more miserable than doing it digitally. So literally our time is less miserable. And if you look at the drivers of well-being as they apply in the workplace, you've got health and relationships, which we've talked about. But the others are security and the environment that you're in. And actually some of the things that will improve both well-being and work will be in this can we improve how we do what we do space, as well as our purpose and all the other things that come with it.
And are there any natural policy implications or recommendations that come out of that?
So one is you can measure all of those 5 drivers in the workplace, which I think is a government-y type thing to do. But the other thing is actually a lot of the changes will come from outside government. So how, in terms of a regulatory environment, in terms of what the government can do, it needs to obviously be ready and follow these other industries who will be innovating. So it needs to be a cross-sector response, which I think is what's really exciting about the sorts of things you're trying to do here.
Yeah. Jennifer, would you say that there are any recommendations, policy, industry or cross-sector recommendations that you would be saying should be top of mind?
For the development of new technologies?
The development of new technologies and for maximising the positive impact on health and well-being while minimising any possible negative impact.
Well, one has to almost, on the healthcare side, there just needs to be a whole lot more thinking about the development of new technology, in particular in service change as opposed to drug development and new discoveries. And a lot of the attention in my world is on the science, not on the service delivery side. So I think that absolutely needs, and the impact on the workforce of role change and managing that, I think, are the big areas. We're on the case, I would say,
Right.
but it's slow going, and you have to look at the economic situation we're in and whether or not capital investment that will be needed to digitalise the NHS, on which a lot of these technologies will be developed, will be protected in future. So that's another big issue, but it's going to require a lot of thinking. But quite frankly, if we want to sustain a viable social model of a healthcare, not just here but in all countries, we are going to have to rapidly develop our thinking on this. In a way, it's been so sluggish in the past.
And I suspect that applies to many more sectors too. Certainly it applies to education as well as to healthcare. Thank you very much to our panellists. We're not quite done with you, I'm afraid. Now the really tough stuff begins. And I'm going to open up questions to the floor here and to Slido. I think some questions are going to come up here. And I'm going to move between the room and the questions on Slido. I know those of you in the room have been able to put some questions onto here, but if you prefer to put your hand up and do it the old-fashioned way, do feel free to do so. I'm going to go with the first 2 hands that have come up, and then I'll move to Slido. Thank you very much. Would you mind just saying your name, where you're from, and then your question?
Sure. Hi, I'm Bianca Stringini.
There's a microphone coming to you, actually.
Thank you. I'm Bianca Stringini. I work with diversity and inclusion for 15 years now, and I really find very interesting to hear what you were talking about, especially around engagement, as well-being has become a big part of the inclusion conversation and definitely the ASG discussion. I actually have 2 questions. One is more around autonomy of work. You talked a lot about it. I would like you to maybe elaborate a little bit about what is the expectation around autonomy at work? Because, coming from an organization design perspective, companies actually tend to design roles very specifically, and actually lack of clarity about roles also makes people very anxious. So, how do you give autonomy and flexibility and yet do the corporate piece where you need to know what people are actually doing, and they need to have that clarity. And the second question I have is, I've mostly worked for American companies. I've recently moved to the UK. I agree that there is a big difference between American and British leadership styles. I do think that the American companies fill in the gap for the American government, who doesn't do a lot of employee protection. What is the gap that UK employers should be filling, since the welfare protection in the UK is quite large? Thank you.
Any thoughts? Would you like
Sir?
to start first? Yes.
Now, what we mean by autonomy at work is flexibility to choose how you do things within the framework that the company gives you. Obviously, you're not going to employ, even if it's only 100 employees, and tell them all, you know what we're doing here, go and do your own thing. That they need coordination and all that. But you don't do what you mentioned in your question, that you define very, very precisely what the role is going to be. And then as the line manager, you get it and you check against the things that you set the role and you didn't do this right or that wrong. You basically allow people to choose how to do things. For example, when you're in retail and it comes to serving customers, don't tell them how to talk to customers and where to take them first and where to take them second. Just let them use their own initiative and do it. It's down to things like that. And this brings you to the second one on American managers. It's not the welfare actually that I had in mind when I mentioned it. And I don't think it's the kind of welfare provision by American companies vis-a-vis the British ones that makes a difference. It's more the way that the manager is treating the worker, that they treat them as stakeholders and as assets. The human capital of the company is an asset of the company. And in the way that you try and improve your capital stock and make it technologically more advanced, you try and improve your human capital asset through training programs, by giving them more flexibility, by inviting them to talk more informally about what do they see that might be improved in the company, what role can we give you. And the companies that do that are much more successful. I've come across a McKinsey Global Institute study, for example, recently, that they were drawing distinction between what they were calling the very progressive companies when it comes to human capital. That they were the ones that were giving at least 75 hours a year of training to the employees and giving them more autonomy about what times they did the work, how they came in, where there were young families involved, how they dealt with that. And they were much more successful companies in terms of rates of return, as well as overall performance and investments, and the way people looked at them as attractive companies. Now it's very important, although I should stop. But the fact that we now see loads of company rankings done. There was one by the EFT on inclusion, for example. I think it helps actually. I think they should be given more publicity, which they are not. I'm sure you've probably never seen the. How many of you have seen the FT ranking? I thought there might be only one or two. Because you're working on it, but this is not something. Yeah, I was surprised when I saw what companies were on top. Actually, it made me feel less annoyed that whenever I try to book a hotel, I cannot avoid Booking.com. But after I read it, I decided maybe it's not a bad thing because they ranked very, very high.
Wonderful. Jennifer, I think you wanted to come in on that, and then actually I'm going to stick with the topic of autonomy briefly before we go to the comment at the back, and there's a Slido question for Nancy, so if you can hold your thought on that. Jennifer's going to come in on the topic.
Just on the question, what sort of protections are we talking about here? I think anyone interested in this should be reading Sarah O'Connor in the Financial Times. She writes brilliantly, and she sort of goes to the coalface, goes into sort of employer areas and can see what's happening, and in this country and in other countries. Focusing on low-paid workers. I mean, you just have to, I mean, one example which is obvious is, you know, the cloth people working in textiles in Leicester. You know, still not paid a minimum wage, still but working incredible hours. Everybody knows about it. No one's doing anything about it, despite the fact we have protections. And one of the factors that Sarah talks about is the fact that the sort of what I was talking, the protective shielding, which includes the health and safety sort of apparatus, is just been eroded. So that we might have guidelines, but they're not being protected. And set alongside that, you know, the fact that unionisation has halved since the 70s. So there's not even that kind of collective presence either. So it takes Uber drivers to take Uber to, they don't have a union, they don't have a kind of legal protection that would otherwise be policed by the health and safety or whatever it is. So it's to do with not just safety issues, it's also to do with precariousness and how workers are treated. That is that you really have to do the work that Sarah is to see it and describe it.
Thank you, thanks. Nancy, do you mind answering the question on Slido, which says, an anonymous comment has asked about your note that autonomy's fallen through the floor in the last 25 years. Firstly, could you elaborate on that statement? And secondly, if you wouldn't mind giving some thoughts on how we might reverse the trend.
Yeah, and I like the questions, 2 questions below that.
Yeah, we'll get to all of them.
So why did I say that autonomy is fallen through the floor? So there's a very good survey that looked at the change in discretion that we had at work over 25 years, and the shift, and it was like 30% drop, which is a massive shift in a metric like these. We don't normally see that. The tricky bit is that we don't actually know what works on autonomy at work. We do know that autonomy, mastery and relatedness are sort of basic human needs. We need them. We get that, and the sort of the idea of control is something that's everywhere. We are choosing often to get that autonomy in terms of the work that people are shifting towards to do. So they're shifting to self-employment, where you do get more of that, or to freelance work, where you do get more control often, but at the expense of other things. And so we're not necessarily taking informed choices, or not long-term informed choices as well. So often we will choose the job and the money over the things that help keep us well. But I think that would be an area where we need to measure better and research better, because I don't think we know the answer yet, which is not very helpful, I'm sorry.
No, I think knowing what we don't know is actually quite helpful, because it starts to direct our priorities. Would you like to come in on that? And then actually, if I could ask you to think about Roger's question while I take the next question in the room as well. Sorry, yes.
It might be on this. Is it on this issue that you wanted?
If you don't mind, I'll take that in a second. So, Jennifer.
Sorry, it was just a random. I was reading a
tried the mutiny, but it didn't
there
work.
Is a mutiny. It's being suppressed.
Just a random addition to the. I read a survey recently. I think it was commissioned by Public First or carried out by Public First. 3,000 people, 1,000 in America, 1,000 in Germany, 1,000 in the UK, on attitudes to work, particularly of older workers over 50. And we were an outlier again in the most negative attitudes to work in this country. So quite of what was underneath that to do with, you know, experience at work, not just the fact of working. I think is an interesting.
Yeah. We definitely need more. Is it directly on this topic? Do you mind me asking? Yes.
Autonomy and what Jennifer said.
Go for it. And then I thank you for your patience. Right.
So
and there are other hands are noted. Please go ahead.
So I was really drawn to your comment about work as a craft, and it does tie into autonomy. I worked in technology staffing for 20 years, and I watched from the 1990s through to kind of 2015, 2016, a deterioration in employer approaches to developmental potential. And it seemed to be the case that more and more employers were looking to hire somebody with the full suite of competencies, rather than allowing people the opportunity to develop and grow into their roles and expand their capabilities. So it seems, you know, very transactional and very just buy what you need for the time that you need it and then do away with it when you have finished with it. I think that is my observation of the labour market. I know we have things like apprenticeship schemes and so on that are available in the country, but how, from a policy perspective, might we think about how we talk about upskilling in practice? I know we talk about lifelong learning, continuous learning. Linda's written great stuff about the need for us all to keep on learning, but it doesn't operationalise, and I'm really interested in what you might think about that.
Anyone want to take? Do you want to go?
I mean, I'm happy to go. It picks up some of the questions on Slido as well, which is about what reward L&D, OD experts are responding to this. And I think I've observed something similar, actually. We're also really bad at absorbing the learning from individuals into organisations as well. It sticks with the individual and they move, and the organisation doesn't benefit in the same way. So I think there's a couple of things that I wanted to say on this. One is that learning, people management are core things in terms of doing business well and getting stuff from your employees. They also improve well-being. So they feel like in the core business of what you're doing, like systems and processes, that you can do that are win-wins. Volunteering, actually skills-based volunteering in professions is another one. So strengthening those professions, which is a real pull for this stuff, is another way to do it. What I'm seeing in the L&D and the HR space is actually it is broader than that. So you're bringing in occupational health and safety are all sort of coming together to understand it. So you now have people who are heads of wellbeing in organisations pulling on all of these different levers, whether it's L&D, whether it's OD, whether it's reward, whether it's health and safety, whether it's occupational health, whether it's the facilities management, and looking at how they can use all of those to build their wellbeing plan. So do they know their people? Do they know their context? Do they know the wellbeing drivers in that context? And do they have a plan that they adapt and monitor to deliver it? That's the thing we have the strongest evidence base for at the moment. And so that's what we're seeing in terms of those trends. And I think there are real win-wins in terms of good work and wellbeing that we're not paying as much attention to because we get really excited by the latest interesting fad.
Thank you. We've got a question at the back, and then we'll move to the side. Thank you for your patience.
Hi, my name's Gavin. I'm from London South Bank University, and I'm an academic and postgraduate researcher. I'm also an associate researcher for a third sector organisation called URSA. And my interest is really around, we can't go into the future of work and not talk about young people. And, you know, we're talking about the future of work, but we're also talking about the future work from a perspective where there's health and challenges and that. And I'm a teacher and engineer. And we've got a strike on the 1st of February for teachers. And that's really an effect. That's going to have an effect on both young people and the future. And it's a sector that is really a litmus test, for, you know, that creates the future of work, and an environment that creates the future of work. So the environment in which teachers are under pressure today and set a precedent for the future. I'm just interested in your views on what the future looks like for young people and the future of education as it's under such great pressure today.
Thank you. And as the microphone moves across down to here, we'll take Roger's question as well. Jennifer, could I ask you to respond to that possibly? You mentioned that a very large proportion of men, particularly aged 16 to 24, were neither in education or in work. What does this mean for the future of our young people?
I mean, I think the factor that I would point to the most that is worrying at the moment is the increase in depression and anxiety amongst teenagers. And it really has grown very significantly since 2011, and nobody is quite sure what the reasons underlying that. It affects men and girls and boys, particularly girls actually. And what we don't know is whether that is just a peak that will just come down as quickly as it went up, or whether it's actually going to be carried into the future, into cohorts. So that's one factor. The other factor is, I'm being a bit booky today, but there's a really interesting book by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff called The Coddling of the American Mind. And this is a description of basically trends in young people's patterns of behaviour and thought, and how this is, which we're seeing in my workplace as well, and probably in your educational establishment, of attitudes of wanting psychological safety, wanting to have much more support, feeling more fragile, and that is spilling into, firstly, is hitting schools, then it's hitting educational establishments, further education and so on, and then it's hitting HR departments in the world of work. And we're seeing it across some employers. I mean, I'm seeing whiffs of it in my organisation too. So we cannot we will have to devote a lot more time to understanding this particular cohort, and probably similar cohorts behind them, to adapt to what they are asking for and the support that they are needing. Sorry, that's a sort of high-level answer, but it's that's quite apart from the reasons why they might not be in the world of work and not even claiming benefits, which is what I was referring to earlier, so economic inactivity. But I do think there's a societal a set of context factors which are causing this kind of fragility and lack of resilience that we will have to respond to, quite apart from the older age group and the long-term illness.
And that's going to require multi-sectoral responses, of course, not least of which will need to come from the health sector, which is struggling to keep up with the needs that generates. So yes, if we can move to the next question in the room, and then we'll take Roger's question, and we'll come back to more questions in the room. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Brynjolfsson, in from the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. Great discussion, and I want to pick up on a few things that Chris mentioned earlier, that despite having some amazingly powerful technologies, we haven't seen mass unemployment or anything like it. We have seen wage polarization and job quality issues, and as Nancy mentioned, creating widely shared prosperity is a key goal. Be interested in your thoughts on, these same technologies could be used to substitute or complement, loosely speaking. They can be used to raise wages, or they can be used to replace and drive down wages. What are some policies, some specific policies that we might put in place to encourage the technologies to be used more to create shared prosperity, more to complement workers, and more to create benefits that are more widespread, as opposed to concentrating wealth and power?
Chris, are you happy to respond to that one?
I'm happy to hear your question. I'm not sure about the answer. I think that's the big question, really, isn't it? So obviously, if I knew the answer, you would probably know that I knew the answer, because you would see it published in some top publication somewhere. But let me speculate. Well, first of all, if you go back to the technology that you said we are not seeing mass unemployment, is true. I think where it helps there actually is something that maybe we missed by talking very clearly between complementarity and substitution. The way it is was what I was mentioning before. Because we have the labor shortage, aging populations and people taking more leisure time off it, hours of work falling and all that, then the two can work together in that it's good to have more substitution to free labor to go and do other more interesting things. So let the robots do all the manual work, and then there is some happy future when there is no manual labor remaining. Like go back a couple of hundred years ago and think of the Green Revolution. We thought everyone was employed. The vast majority of people were employed in agriculture. We thought, if you mechanize agriculture, what's going to happen with them? In fact, it's freed them, and they went and did more productive jobs elsewhere than what they were doing before, and that's how we got growth. Also, what's happened to China in the last 40 years, for example, is a good example. So that's the way I see technology. That is good to go for the substitution, because there is labor shortage, and there are many other jobs that can be done, more creative jobs, more interesting jobs to do. Now, if you do that, though, you still have the problem of distribution, because you get, how do you determine pay in that case? And if there is going to be so much machinery doing jobs like robots, then that goes to the owners of the machinery, the capital owners, and therefore the share of labor is falling. And that's the big question that we really don't know the answer. I can offer you an answer actually that I first heard from Peter Diamond, that he was talking to another economist who disliked the word redistribution. He said, it's awful, why should you redistribute? I'm sure you've come across many economists of that kind. And Peter was saying, well, okay, no, it's not redistribution, but I think but do you agree that a society that is so mechanized and so improved should take care of poverty? That we should eliminate poverty through government programs, the way these Swedes are doing and all that? And of course, most people will say yes. Well, you're not going to fund that with debt. You have to put taxation to fund that. Therefore, you tax high incomes more to a fund, which it makes sense. And therefore, you have the redistribution taking place indirectly, in that the capital owners pay for anti-poverty programs that include education, good social care, the sort of Scandinavian way, and therefore you get a redistribution through through the provision of good quality social services. But to achieve that, you need to trust the public sector that is going to supply good quality social services. And when I look at our public sector over the last 10 years, I'm not sure I would trust them to provide it.
Well, I suppose that relationship between chronic underfunding and trust is there. There's not so much you can do with the resources available. And the other missing piece is potentially political will, the will to tax higher income earners and companies at a higher rate.
Yes, I mean,
go for it.
I mean, someone mentioned about education and nurses striking and all that, and the response of government is that we cannot afford it. I mean, that's not. It's not an answer, is it? What does it mean? You cannot afford it? It means you cannot. You don't want to. Yeah, you don't want to tax.
Yeah. Roger is on Slido and has been waiting very patiently. Yes. So I'd like to pick up Roger's question. Roger says, we're at the beginning of a new industrial revolution. Healthcare and medical diagnoses will change dramatically. Which new jobs will be created? Anyone on the panel want to give us some thoughts on new jobs?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was the EU Commission have just put an interesting document out on the impact of one particular technology, AI, on healthcare and what's the impact. And it says that there are sort of 4 areas. One is clinical practice, with a lot more impact on using AI for diagnostic. So there'll be a lot of diagnosticians, I would say, for starters. Data mining to look at pattern recognition. DeepMind is an example there. Another is biomedical research, drug discovery, and so on. Vaccines, folding proteins, again, DeepMind involved in that too. Public health is another area. Patterns of ill health, spotting clusters, community surveillance and tracing, and that kind of thing. And then the 4th area is to do with the flow of healthcare, to the healthcare administratives, the flow of so there'll be jobs in all of those areas. I think one of the, above all of that, I think is in clinical practice, is the ability to shift quite a lot of care from medical staff to people who do not have such an intensive training, and through decision support, as I said earlier, they'll be able to treat more patients safely. I think that's a massive area, given if you look at the morbidity load that's increasing in future, a lot of that disease will be managed at home and in the community. So people who can help the patient with decision support and using AI-based technologies will be, I think that's a big growth area. But actually, one of the biggest growth areas in terms of the healthcare workforce will be all of us as patients, because we will be doing far more, as everyone has said, through these technologies, not just the ChatGPT that's come out recently, the large language processing models, the generative models, but through these decision supports. Why wouldn't we just look at that first rather than going to? So we'll be doing quite a lot of heavy lifting, I think. And again, that raises questions about EDI and diversity and the inclusion of people who are able to do that. There will need to be support for those individuals, so there'll be a growth area there. So decision support, more people, assistant physicians or not physicians themselves. So adding value, I think, will be the... But in terms of face-to-face care, that will remain and grow.
Well, that's the one that will grow, in fact. The more technical jobs, diagnosis, and that, if anything, there will be fewer of those jobs created in future, because machinery will be doing most of the work. But face-to-face care, though, will grow and grow. And I think we should. It's about time we treat it as a proper profession where it needs specialized training. It's not It's not easy, where it's very easy for our mothers to give us good care, but mothers are unique.
Well, I think you just touched on exactly how I was going to respond, and that was to say there are some real gender issues that are behind the fact that it's
They're not around forever.
or highly, and the idea that it's easy for mothers. I can tell you as a mother, it's not so easy. Okay.
It's easy if you're the recipient of mother's care.
It's easier to recipient, absolutely. Okay, brilliant. I'm going to take one question in the room, if you don't mind, and then we'll move to Jim's question on geography. Thank you.
Sure. Hi there. I'm Alexia Cambon. I'm a researcher on the future of work for Microsoft. I was very interested in the sort of tone you adopted on productivity early in the conversation when you kicked off. It feels like productivity is rapidly becoming a little bit of a controversial word. I was on the team who last year we rolled out productivity paranoia as a concept, the idea that employees think that they're working harder than ever and leaders think they're not working at all. So I'm very curious about the mindset as relates to productivity. I have a friend who asked me a couple of weeks ago, I'm really nervous when my little dot on Teams is orange because my manager's going to think if it's orange for 2 hours that I'm not doing any work. And that seems to be a fear that is very deeply embedded in many employees. I know if my Teams dot is orange for 2 hours, it's because I'm out on a run. And that is a really important part of my workday. That is where I get my best ideas. That's where my mind resets. And so I'm wondering to what extent we really need to rethink what productivity looks like and what it means, and how we shape mindsets, especially for managers around that. And curious as to any thoughts from you.
How we adjust in a post-presenteeism world. Okay. Any thoughts? Actually, Nancy, shall I throw that one to you first?
Yes, I love that you've gone for a run in the middle of the day. So one of the things that we did
Have you gone for a run at all?
Well, when the days are darker, being able to go for a run in the middle of the day is a much better thing, particularly if you're a woman and don't want to run at night. It's a much safer thing to do. So we allow people to adjust those working patterns because we can, but that doesn't work the same if you're delivering a baby on 24/7 on Christmas Day evening. You can't quite adapt your shift in the same way. So just recognising that some people can't do that. I think digital has allowed managers to control things in a way that they perhaps didn't before, but also there's a lot of perceptions that managees also have of how they're being managed that may or may not be true. And that shift to digital working really showed some of those things up about how we manage on both sides, like the assumptions that are made on both sides of the fence about what are measured and what. I do think we haven't quite understood productivity. I think there's some really exciting stuff happening on how we measure it, how we understand it, how we map it. What that means for, like, if an area of the country has a high GVA, right? What does that distribute in terms of, like, the people? So Ireland does ridiculous things in terms of its numbers, but actually if you look at the distribution within the population, it's not quite the same. So does that benefit transfer? So I think we've got some work to do on productivity. We think if it's harder than perhaps it is, and I say that because wellbeing often gets held up as a fluffy one, and it's very robust in many ways compared to those. But I do think there are a lot of preconceptions around, and I think there's some fantastic research from during the pandemic about how we manage in those digital worlds and flexibly and remotely. And many places have always done it, and we can learn from them.
Actually, Nancy, can I push you a little bit further on the correlation between well-being and productivity? Are these things, do you have to sacrifice well-being to improve productivity, or can they work?
This is always one of the ones that we always have an argument with the Department for Business on. Like, well-being is the opposite, and this idea that, and actually this is very common from that stress is bad and relaxing is good, and well-being is relaxing and work is hard. Doing hard things well with other people is hugely rewarding. Actually, we've got it. And that also includes family and parenting, which is why we've got the incentives all wrong as well. So how do we, and that often shows up in the purpose data, but those purpose professions sort of then don't talk about the sort of pay need, and we overuse the tool of purpose. So I think we can get a lot more subtlety in that. It's quite hard to do it in 2 minutes, really. But there's lots of ideas in terms of whether productivity, you can be, the top two drivers of wellbeing at work are interesting work and your colleagues, right? But you can have brilliantly interesting work, get on brilliantly with colleagues and do an awful job. So it's not automatically correlated. And actually some of the engagement stuff was quite disturbing as well. So people can be really engaged and not performing well. And there were some weird diversity implications of that actually as well. And so I think we really need to understand it a lot better and understand what we mean by productivity, particularly when we've got a service-based economy.
Yeah, thank you. We've got a question in the third row, and then, yes, I'll come to the question in the second row. I note your hand at the back. I just want to see if there's anyone I'm ignoring on the left-hand side of the room. No, that's brilliant. So we've got a few questions in the room, but I'm just going to move between those questions and Slido. So third row, thank you very much. But we're going to ask Jim's question while, if you don't mind just hanging on. Jim has asked, what is the geography of wellbeing and work in the context of levelling up and northern industrial towns? Are there examples of success stories? Chris, could I throw that one to you? Do you know of any success
No, I think they both know a lot more about northern towns than I do.
Okay, I see. It's back to you, Nancy.
I mean, I love this question.
I thought you
for a couple of things. Also, it picks up the young people question as well. So young people's wellbeing now is our future wellbeing as a nation. So wellbeing at 14 is predictive of later wellbeing at 8 years later. And I think that's the concern about mental health and our young people. So the projects like the Be Well one in Greater Manchester is super exciting, helping us understand how young secondary school pupils will how we can address that wellbeing issue cross-sector. And I think, so what we can see from job quality, it is partly the northern industrial towns, but it's also sort of coastal ports and pretty much anywhere that post-industrial areas. But we can see that there's usually an low education penalty to wellbeing, but there are some parts of the country where that's not the case, and that's really interesting question. Some of those are military, and the skills and the sort of social mobility powerhouse that is some of the things that happens in our military. But some of them are really diverse areas, and there's some parts of the country that have a lot of young people. They're going to be the engines of what happens next, and they're hugely diverse as well. So that changes what you're doing in terms of how they're connected and what they need as well. But there are some success stories, and there are places that are really turning around. But some of that is also making sure that those jobs that are creative are for people that live there as well, and they feel like they're So I'm thinking Grimsby was where we were not so long ago, but there are lots of examples across the whole of the north, and we did some of those with What Works local level economic growth, if you want to see them.
Great, thank you. So more resources available. If we can take your question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Aida Garcia Lazaro from the University of Bath. So I wanted to link a bit the issue of productivity with the question on complementarity, substitution of jobs. So there is evidence that shows that there is an increase in productivity because of the new technologies, but also there is a negative impact on wages and the labor income share. And so in economics, people tend to link labor productivity with the determination of wages. So but it's been shown that there is a big or an increasing gap over the years, at least in the US and the UK. So do we need to rethink how we set wages to not just think about other alternative distribution policies like the ones you were mentioning, in a way that is a fair payment? And what do we do with this puzzle? Thank you.
Chris, I think that one is yours.
Yes, it's another one of those important questions that I'm not sure I understand the answer. I mean, you're right that it's been decoupling of productivity and wages, and there is a vast literature trying to explain, whether is it due to different deflators that we use for consumer goods than producer goods, or is it because of the basically collapse of unions in both US and UK, and I think the answer is that all of these have contributed. But beyond that, I don't know what to say. Other like that, you're saying we need to rethink how wages are determined. I mean, I agree with you. I've always favored more a kind of bargaining model of wages, even at the completely micro level. But I mean, productivity will always influence wages. But it's true that even if you get now the way labor markets are organized, even if you get a productivity rise, it doesn't necessarily follow that wages will go up in the future. We it becomes a political question at the end whether we have enforcement mechanisms for companies to offer higher wages, and currently we don't have them in place.
Jennifer, did you want to come in on that? Yes.
Actually, I just wanted to ask Chris.
Yeah.
Are there countries that have different structural factors in the economy where that divergence between high income and low income has not been so great? And I'm thinking particularly about ownership, corporate ownership. I'm just thinking of Germany and the corporate model and things where, maybe there's more of a commitment to longer term staying power, less commitment to shareholders, ability and incentives to invest in the workforce more, for example. Remember Will Hutton's review of ownership a few years ago? I'm just interested to know whether there's a country.
No, what Germany is it's the most successful of the bigger economies in that, but I think the big successes in that are more the Scandinavians, Sweden, Denmark, Norway mainly, not so much Finland. But again, I think it's probably the tax system actually that make them do that. Although there is also a kind of social conscience, if you like, when they're giving bonuses and all that. They're all lower. So now, of course, that the way. Sort of cultural influences, and there is a tendency in economics now to talk more about culture and the impact that it has. But culture changes very, very slowly in any economy, whereas the tax system and the incentives it gives, it could change faster in the provision of services by governments, was what I was mentioning before, to show that that although you're paying higher taxes, you're getting something out of it rather than vaguely just throwing it away.
Thank you. I think we've got time. We're almost out of time. I'm going to take one more question from the audience, and then we'll end where we began with another investigation of autonomy, and we will close the session. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Isabella Lee. I work for Cindy Health, and I guess I have a kind of two-part question. So we've built a product that analyses employee mental health using the same questions that you get asked if you went to your GP. And then we use AI and machine learning to make personalised recommendations to the best digital mental health services for each employee. So my kind of two questions are, firstly, are employers really looking to support their employees right now? From our side at the moment, many employers seem to be giving access to like Calm or Headspace as a plaster. And then secondly, what do you think is the best way to help decision makers within these companies understand mental health or the mental health problem that exists and take action to support employees and really see the return on investment that exists in correlation to this too, that we see on our side?
Great.
Thank you.
Nancy, could we start with you on that and then get your comment, Jennifer?
Yeah, and actually it picks up with one of the comments
does,
here
yes,
about the
on
boards
mental
as well.
health,
As well. So I think there's a huge enthusiasm from employers, from boards, from employees to do something around mental health at work, which is fantastic and brilliant. Big change. I think we know far less about what we can do that works, and I think some of the things that are viewed as plasters or nice to haves are actually really effective. They're just used in different ways. Headspace is a really interesting one. We've tested it against something that was tailored, and it was more effective because it was easier to use. So I think the idea that some things are plasters, or it's just about the individual, or it's just about the organisation, it's always yes and. There's not a silver bullet. I think there's a very good question about the role of what the role of CEO and boards are, and we've been looking at what that looks like, actually particularly in the NHS with the Wellbeing Guardians, thinking because they've introduced those, what does a board role look like and what's their job versus a head of wellbeing in an organisation or an individual manager. So getting much more robust on that. I think managers really and leaders want to do something. They don't necessarily know what works or what's right for their workforce, and I think it's why it needs to be part of a plan. I do also think, though, that also raised another question on here, which is about small businesses, freelancers, etc. And I think lots of people in the UK economy are not in big organisations which don't support, and we're seeing a split also between key workers and these higher paid jobs as well. where you can negotiate high pay and all these benefits, but not necessarily the same in these other roles that we once saw as core. I think in terms of small businesses, and I think there's some really, and freelancers, and actually more broadly the sector's economy, we're seeing sector charities step up, we're seeing professions step up, and that's a really good way to address it. So working with industry bodies is a really clever one. But also the things that local areas are doing. So West Midlands have their mental health productivity pilot, which is really robustly testing something and rolling it out with small businesses in the region. So I think there are some really exciting ways that can do it. I think there's lots of things that work. Getting the right things for your workforce is what matters.
Thank you. Jennifer, if I can ask you for a very brief
Very brief. Yes, good, excellent, positive, very good. I mean, I think the one thing I would say is that there's one sort of way of conceptualising the mental health of your workforce is that, you know, these are conditions that you need to support the individual to overcome and develop resilience. But there's another conversation with that employers must have, is whether the nature of the work that they are offering and the management practices in that organisation are contributing a wider context of anxiety and stress that is then tipping people over into mental health. And that is much more resistance to that, I would imagine, than developing well-being sites or yoga rooms or whatever it is, algorithms. So I think that's the proviso, I think, which is the next step on.
Right, that's a call to arms for the future. If you could all join me in thanking our excellent panellists.